The best part of being a real estate agent is connecting families with their dream homes. Filling out the purchase and sale agreement is not the best part. Here's Tennessee real estate agent Misty Woodford to walk you through it.
You always want to make sure you have the most accurate information possible. Representing the buyer, you would fill out the buyer information here. We'll just put test buyer. And then on undersigned seller, you also want to make sure you have accurate information. You can get that from the tax records, or if the listing agent has uploaded the information on the MLS, such as a confirmation of agency form, you would have the information available there. For this case, we'll just put in sample seller. And then your tract of land that they're purchasing. For example, here we just have 123 Main Street in Davidson County are no longer listed with a deed book and page. They have an instrument number. So again, from the tax record, you would put that information in. In your outlying counties, you probably will have deed book and page information available on the tax record. Information such as further described as, this is where you may put in a subdivision or lot number or other descriptive information that you can find in the tax record. In your included paragraph, that's pre-printed information, but you do see a blue box where it talks about remote controls. You want to make sure they actually have some and aren't using their car as the pre-programmed, but we'll assume they have two that they're going to provide. Other items that remain with the buyer at no additional cost. This is where you would typically see a refrigerator or maybe a washer and dryer. Items that will not remain with the property. So if the drapes, for example, do not remain, you would put that. Or if there's a play set or a trampoline in the backyard that you want to make sure the seller removes so your buyer doesn't have to, that's where you would put that information. Our next line item is leased items that remain with the property. Again, it says there security system, water softener systems, fuel tanks. You want to make sure your buyer understands what it means for it to be left or to not be left. Next is our purchase price. If you type in a number there, it's going to pre-populate the words. Next, on our financing contingency and the loan to be obtained, you need to put the maximum loan amount number that they would get here. Assuming they're going to do a conventional loan, we would put 80% there. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't do a 70% loan, but the most that they would be getting on the loan is what you're going to put in there. And then as you scroll down, you're going to have to indicate the type of loan that they may be getting. New in this year's purchase and sale agreement is the rural development and the THDA loan. We'll click conventional, but of note is if they're choosing a VA loan or an FHA loan, that you would also have to include the appropriate addendum. The other box here would be where you indicate if they are getting a house loan or a bank underwritten portfolio loan, some other type of loan that would not be conventional. Under loan obligations, it's important that your buyer client understand what their responsibilities are in the process. They have certain timelines that they need to abide by, and it's our job as agents to make sure they understand what it is that they are committing to do in the first 3 and 14 days of the contract in terms of their financing. Financing contingency waived section. This would be for an all-cash purchaser. Important thing to note here is that even waiving your financing contingency does not keep the buyer from being able to get a loan. It's just indicating that obtaining the loan is not a contingency of the contract. In this case, the buyer would need to indicate how they're going to prove that they do in fact have liquid assets to pay for the loan. So you would put bank statement or money market statement here where you're showing that they do have assets available. The next section is our appraisal section. Again, if you are financing this purchase, it must be contingent upon appraisal. If you're not financing the purchase, the buyer would obviously have the choice of whether or not they wanted to waive their appraisal contingency. The next section of the contract talks about closing expenses. It outlines what the typical seller expenses are and what the typical buyer expenses are. As with anything in our purchase and sale agreement, these items are negotiable. And number 3 is title expenses. What happens? Again, there is what we would say is customary in certain areas is whether seller pays title or buyer pays title. But remember, they're all negotiable. And this is one of two places that you would ask for closing cost assistance. So in this case, we're going to say seller to pay all title, search, and title insurance expenses. And then we have an option here. We also need, in this case, the seller to pay $3,000 toward buyer closing costs, prepaids, discount points, and other lender allowables. This would be if your buyer has enough money to pay their down payment but maybe needs a little additional help closing out the loan. This would be the place that you would indicate that. And then you have the closing agency for your buyer, and you're going to indicate that information. Important to note here is the contact information. Because multiple title companies have offices across the state, you want to make sure you include the phone number or address of the particular branch that you will be using for that title company. And on the title agency for the seller, it's always good to call the listing agent and ask them who they prefer for their closing. And go ahead and include that information on the contract. Our next section to fill out talks about our earnest money and trust money. Again, as we discussed earlier, it's important to note that the money must be deposited within whatever time limit we put there. In this case, we're going to put 7 days because our buyer client needs to transfer the money from their savings account to their checking account and let that money clear. And we're going to be holding this at the listing company real estate office. So we'll put ABC Realty. They are located at 1234 Main Street. We're going to say that we're going to give them $2,000 earnest money by check. So we'll just put NA because there's no other source there. And then you have the portion of the contract that talks about what happens if the earnest money is not received, how the earnest money is going to be handled. Now you need to pick a closing date. And I always recommend that you call the listing agent and ask them if there's a date that is preferable to the seller so you understand what terms everyone needs. And if that date is agreeable to your buyer, go ahead and give them the day they want. Just for an example, we're going to choose July 31st. Possession of the property. Are you giving possession of the property on closing day, or is there some temporary occupancy agreement that needs to be included? For this example, we're going to use the closing day. This Greenbelt status section is new in our contract, and it only applies to rural areas where there is a minimum of 15 acres and qualifies otherwise. Because we're doing a purchase in the city of Nashville, the Greenbelt status there will not apply. Special assessments, again, we're assuming seller pays anything that's assessed prior to the closing date unless the buyer would otherwise agree. In this case, we're going to say there are no other special assessments, and that does not apply. Your next section is talking about the deed and how you want the deed made out. Again, you want the legal names of everyone that has taken deed to the property. In this case, we're going to say that it's a single sample buyer. Deed is just going to be in their name. And this house was built after 1978, so lead-based paint does not apply. And then you have the paragraph talking about your inspection period. Again, important to note that the buyer may make the inspection on their own behalf, or in the state of Tennessee, if they're going to have a third party do that inspection, it needs to be a licensed home inspector. So our initial inspections paragraph here talks about what rights they have on doing the inspections, if it's going to exclude anything. Again, I would say don't exclude anything on your termite inspection. You want to make sure all portions of the property are clear, and how many days that you have to do the inspection. Again, per the terms of the contract, this is going to be calendar days. During the busy season, I would always recommend you give yourself 10 to 12 days to make sure you can get a home inspector out there to do it and get your reports back. And then the second section down here underneath the inspection and resolution period talks about that resolution period. Once you get your inspection report back and you've asked for repairs, how many days do the buyer and seller have to negotiate those repairs? A lot of people like to see this as a quick resolution period. One thing to keep in mind is if there are items on the repair request that involve getting a contractor out to review these items, you want to give yourself enough time in this resolution period to make that happen. So I always tell people to give yourself at least 5 days so you can contact the appropriate professionals to come out and give you estimates. If you see that you need to amend this, you could do that after the contract is executed. But again, I like to give at least 5 days. The Waiver of All Inspections box. If you're in a multiple offer situation and your buyer is wanting to waive their inspection to make their offer stronger, you would check this box. In addition to do that, you want to make sure you have them sign the form that notice that you've advised them to get a home inspection and they've waived their right to do so to decrease your liability. The next box there is final inspection. When are you going to come back and review the repair request prior to closing to ensure they've done the repairs? Again, traditionally people have put 0 to 1 days in that. The problem with that is if the repairs are not done, you want to give yourself time prior to closing to get those fixed. So I tell people to do 2 or 3 days there so you have time to give them notice that you have some additional items that need to be handled. We have our legal language for the buyer, and again, make sure that you're explaining to your buyer and seller what these items mean and what their responsibilities are in the process. Our next blanks are home protection plan. Again, we're not in the business of selling home warranties and home protection plans. I would suggest that you have 2 or 3 companies that you have their information, explain what that is to your buyer, and ask them whether or not that they would want one. Again, in a multiple offer situation, you're probably going to lean toward having that waived, as the buyer could buy that after closing for themselves. For this example, we're assuming we're not going to ask for one. Any exhibits and addenda is the next blank that we have to fill out. Again, anything you attach to this contract extends the statute of limitations. A purchase and sale agreement has a 6-year statute of limitations, whereas any of our other addendum would only have a 1-year statute of limitations. So be careful what you attach here. However, if there are any FHA or lead-based paint documents, that would apply, and you would need to attach those here. In this case, we're going to say that we have none because it's a conventional purchase. And then our final box here in the contract that you have to fill out is your special stipulations section. As we talked about earlier, please use the 707 form, the pre-printed language that the state attorneys have provided for any special stipulations, whether that would be sale of home contingency or other special situation. You can actually drop those directly into the purchase and sale agreement by clicking on clause up at the top and selecting the system clauses. And if, for example, we'll just choose the first one there, seller to pay buyer's expenses, and we'll click OK, and it drops that pre-printed language into the contract without you having to type it up. You would just need to change the wording there as to what you want that to be, either a percentage or a dollar amount. And earlier in the contract, we had typed in that $3,000, so we could do that there as well. And then we scroll down to our time-limited offer. When do we want a response by? Again, talk to your broker about different theories if it's a multiple offer situation, but generally I like to be a nice person and give them at least 12, if not 24 hours to respond. So we'll tell them we want a response by 7 o'clock tomorrow night. And then you have your buyer sign. The seller's either going to accept, counter, or reject, and someone is going to fill it in as binding. The very bottom portion of the contract says for information purposes only, but it's important to note this information must be filled out for the lender according to their new guidelines. So you want to make sure you go ahead and fill in the listing company's information, your company's information as the selling company, your license number, the other agent's license number, your telephone numbers, and any HOA information that you have available. If you don't have some of this information, again, I would encourage you to call the listing agent before you make the offer and ask them for the information, because it makes your offer just look cleaner when you submit everything at one time.